Okay, so we're covering psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic therapy, counseling theory. Let me go over here. So we're going to first cover a theory overview, and then we'll discuss key concepts and techniques. Then we'll talk about application, specifically on the exam, what these questions might show up like on the actual NCE. And then obviously we'll have more time for questions and answers once we're done. So psychoanalytic theory overview. Obviously, with psychoanalytic, we're talking about Sigmund Freud. He's the major figure that initiated this. He also, is kind of seen as the founder of counseling. A lot of the other theories are based on this, even though now psychoanalytic theory is not necessarily used as predominantly as it once was. You can still see traces of the psychoanalytic theory showing up in lots of other counseling methods. And I think just because it's been so predominant, we talk about, repressing things or, our ego, all of that is so familiar to people that, especially as counselors, it tends to get incorporated into our approaches, even if we're not considering ourselves like psychoanalytic theorists. Okay, so primarily having to do with personality structure, the id, the ego, and the superego, and 3 levels of awareness: the unconscious mind, the conscious mind, and the preconscious mind. And so we're going to unpack those a little bit more, but all that psychoanalytic theory does is it basically is working within those different constructs to help the clients gain awareness so that they can function more efficiently within their life and their situations. Okay, so we're going to dive into those a little bit. Let me go ahead and ask if you just joined to mute your audio unless you have a question. Feel free to interrupt me if you do, and I'm happy to answer your questions as we go along. So the goals of treatment with psychoanalytic theory. Goals of treatment are to 1, bring the client's unconscious to the conscious. We're going to unpack this diagram here in just a minute, and that'll make more sense. 2 is to help the client work through repressed conflicts that they might have. 3 is to help the client reach intellectual awareness. And 4th is to help the client restructure their basic personality. So we're going to look at all of those ways that clients get stuck and how bringing their awareness from the unconscious to the conscious helps gain that awareness that they can use to just to improve their life. So key concepts and techniques for psychoanalytic theory. Let's start with just what normal development looks like. For normally developed individuals, it looks like successfully resolving and integrating the psychosexual stages of development. And this leads to normal personality development. So when individuals are able to move just very fluidly through these psychosexual stages.
Okay, Josh, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you for a minute. I can't get it to enlarge on my because I can't get it to. I think I'm going to leave and come back in.
Okay, so if I'm understanding what you're looking for, up in the top right-hand corner, there should be different views that you can select. You see where it says? And so I'm not sure if it's one of those settings that needs to be adjusted to be able to see the screen that's shared. I can stop sharing it and reshare it, and that might do the trick too.
I think that if you stop sharing and reshare, that would be the
okay.
Trick.
Hi, Brooke.
Okay.
It's good to see you.
Oh, I think I got it. Or
all
now
right.
It's enlarged. Thank you.
Okay, resharing. Are we good now? Can you see
yes,
it?
Yes, we're good now. Thank you so
Perfect.
much.
Yeah, thank you for interrupting for that. Okay, so these psychosexual stages are unique to Freud. These are what he proposed as the developmental stages that individuals go through. And so a little mnemonic that you can use for these is Orphan Annie's A Pretty Little Girl. That's one that we encourage our students to use. And so if you need to know the order, Orphan Annie's A Pretty Little Girl. oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. And so from birth to 1 year, the primary source of interaction is through the mouth. If you think about a baby is always putting things in their mouth. That's how they're sensing their world. That's how they gain their nutrition. That's how they feel secure, is they're being well fed. And so oral stage is birth to 1 year. The anal phase is 1 to 3 years old. This really is the focus on relating to controlling their bladder and bowel movements. Obviously, during this phase of life, becoming potty trained is one of the primary milestones to achieve. Between 3 to 6 years old, we have the phallic stage, which focuses on genitals. Children in this stage of life are identifying difference between male and female. A lot of times if there's gender stereotypes that go along with sex, that's when they're differentiating between those things. Freud would also say that this is where the Oedipus and the Electra complex also first show up, where there's an identification with the opposite sex parent. And so as we'll see in the future slides, getting stuck in one of these stages creates different types of difficulties that people can get hung up on. So if a boy is not bonded well with their mom, then they may have issues with females later on. And a lot of times Freud would say that happens because there's been something that's kept them stuck during this phallic stage. From 6 years up until puberty, we have the latent stage. In the latent stage, there's not a whole lot of activity happening sexually. It's just kind of in remission. That's why they call it the latent stage. I think that our society, this might be changing some just because puberty seems to be happening much sooner. And so if Freud were creating a psychosexual stages now, I think that he would probably adjust these, but that is not going to matter a whole lot for testing purposes. So during this stage, the superego is continuing to grow. And as we'll find, the superego is really about gaining a sense of right and wrong, what you feel pride in versus what you feel guilt and shame about. So if you think about like a 7 or 8 year old, who's developing their superego, they're really gaining a sense of right and wrong. They start to actually feel bad when they've disappointed a parent or a teacher or a coach or something. And so even though the id's energies are suppressed, which is the, feed me, very self-absorbed, the superego is still trying to organize what those impulses mean for the child. And then from puberty to death, we have the genital phase, which is all about finding balance, definitely a focus on sexual attraction and connection. And so here is where we find that the ego and the superego are both fully developed, where the id is not so in control as it is in the preliminary years. But the ego, the way that your personality shows up in response to that sense of right and wrong that the superego is feeding you, that's where you find that being fully developed in a normally developed individual. Okay, that's a lot of information right there. So where we see psychoanalytic theory explaining behavioral disorders, they would say that personality flaws are the result from the failure to successfully resolve conflicts at an earlier stage of ego development. So what that means is that if there's some sort of conflict, say in the oral stage, if a baby is denied food, for example, they're going to be stuck there. And so that's going to create this personality flaw. It might mean that they don't feel like they can trust people because they're not being fed. And so that conflict at that stage is going to make it difficult later on for them to function as a typically developed individual. And that creates anxiety. So anxiety occurs when basic conflicts are repressed. Most of us may not be aware of those conflicts. And so we feel the anxiety, we feel the panic, we might notice our heart rate increasing, we might notice that anxiety showing up, but not really understand why. And it's because those conflicts that happened at those stages are repressed and kind of hidden from us for one reason or another. And so the psychoanalytic techniques are intended to make the client become aware of those unconscious conflicts, become aware of what might have happened at this phase of life. That insight results once you become aware of that. It goes from the unconscious mind to the conscious mind. And when the insight results, it allows the ego, your personality, to assimilate this new material. The ego is kind of what, how you cope with whatever that insight is. Because I'm now aware of this, I've got to adjust how I do life, how I do relationships, how I interact with people. So that's how psychoanalytic theory understands behavioral disorders, as there's been some sort of conflict or failure to move into the next stage at any given point in the development. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 levels of awareness. So we have unconscious mind. This is all the things that are happening back in the recesses that unless you've been doing the work, you're unaware of, that you're unconscious. It's all the stuff that's kind of back there in the recesses, and you might be able to access it, but it's unconscious. We have preconscious, which are those things that you may not be thinking about right at the moment, but they can easily be drawn back into your mind. So, most of the time we're not thinking about what we had for breakfast a week ago. But if we spend a little bit of time, we could, track back, okay, last Friday I met so-and-so for breakfast at the restaurant, and I remember ordering the eggs Benedict. And so it's preconscious. It's not deep into our unconscious. It's easily accessible because it's right there and maybe our recent memory. And so even though it's not in our conscious mind all the time, it's right there that we can access with a little effort. And then, of course, we have the conscious mind. And that's what we're experiencing right now. We're aware of it. It's immediate. Right now, your conscious mind is listening to this MasterClass, hearing me talk about conscious, preconscious, and unconscious awareness. And your mind might be thinking about, how is all this going to apply to the NCE? That's your conscious mind. You're probably not thinking about, until I say it, what you have to do tonight after work or after the kids get home. That's all preconscious, except that I've just brought it up. And so now it's in your conscious mind. So that's the 3 levels of awareness: unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. And so, like mentioned earlier, with the goals of psychoanalytic theory, the goal is to bring to the conscious what has been unconsciously keeping us stuck. And the way that Freud would organize that is through the id, the ego, and the superego. So let's talk about those. And that's represented by this iceberg here. So we have the id, which is this pleasure principle. That's what drives the id. It is all about my needs being met right now. And the id is always unconscious. We're not aware of that instinct that's happening. It's it's deep down in the recesses of our mind, and it's what makes you want to do the things that you want to do. You're unaware that it's happening. It's just there. The id is chaotic. It doesn't follow any rules of time. It's just kind of immediate. It's kind of like a selfish 3-year-old that wants what it wants when it wants it. Okay. And so we have the superego, which is how we start to organize those instincts and categorize them into good and bad, for example. And so the id sometimes is compared to the little devil sitting on your shoulder, trying to tell you, you should do that. It's going to be fun. It's going to be great for you. It's going to satisfy you. The superego is saying, well, maybe not. It's the angel sitting on your shoulder. It's the part of you that says, okay, maybe this isn't the best thing. Maybe it is an okay thing. But the superego is what's going to lead you to feel a sense of pride over making a good decision, or a sense of shame or guilt over making a poor decision. A lot of times those categories are determined by cultural norms and what society says is right and wrong. Okay, so the superego helps to categorize the outcome into good or bad, working, not working, beneficial, not beneficial. Ego is based on the reality principle, which basically means that what you choose to do with that information. So our ego is the way that our personality shows up in response to feeling these senses of shame or pride. Okay. When our ego is fully developed, we have a strong sense of who we are. It's not overinflated. It's not posturing. It's just content and functioning well based on what the parameters that the superego has set for ourselves. Does that make sense? I want to pause for any questions that you guys might have.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brooke,
So,
go ahead.
sorry, let me exit this so I can see too. Okay, so I get confused because I just took the full length test right before we did this.
Okay.
And there were quite a few questions dealing with this.
Okay.
And like I flagged a couple of them because it's like, then I went back and like I didn't change my answers, but I second guessed what I picked because
Sure.
I was like, I need to go back and look at this.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't thinking of ego as the reality principle. And when I saw reality principle, I was like, wait a minute. I don't know what that is, but
Okay.
I didn't think of them as the same thing. So to hear you say that and then see that term with the iceberg now
Right.
puts that together.
Yes.
So you're saying that, and I mean, it seems like it's really common sense that your ego is who you are.
Right. Yeah.
But when you look at this super ego and you're going, okay, my personality is based on what I think is right or wrong or good or bad, and that makes me content with my choice. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. So the superego, there's no action to it.
Okay, it's just a feeling, more or less,
Yeah,
or a
it's a feeling or an impulse, or think of it as a way of categorizing. Okay, so let me give an example. Okay,
Okay.
so a child is walking into the kitchen and there's a pan of freshly baked cookies sitting on the stove. Mom or dad is nowhere to be found. Okay, the id says, cookies, get them, they're delicious, I want to eat them, right? That's what the id is telling the child to do without even trying. And that's all subconscious, right? It's all in that unconscious level, okay? The superego is going to say, oh yeah, that would be delicious, right? It would be good for the taste. It would be yummy. We like cookies, we know that. But it's also saying, but you haven't been given permission. It's saying you might get a tummy ache. The last time you reached for a cookie that was, on a pan on top of the oven, it was really hot, right? And so the superego is not action oriented. It's just kind of about categorizing what the id is presenting. Does that make sense?
That word helps a lot. The categorize and takes away the feeling or emotion part of it. I like that.
Yes.
Word that helps. Thank you.
And so you can see that the superego exists in the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious mind. It's happening all the time in all ways because we're constantly organizing that information and categorizing it into good or bad. The ego, on the other hand, is what shows up in reality. This is where, let's just say this little kid can't be trusted when there's a plate of cookies because his personality has been shaped by the reality that if there's a cookie on a pan, he's going to eat it, right? His ego is the part of him that actually acts on whatever the superego does. Okay, great questions. Does this make sense?
Yeah, so who's the moderator between the two? The ego?
The ego. The ego is however the ego chooses to respond, that's what shapes that personality. So if the child consistently chooses to take the cookie and gets punished consistently, that is the reality. The reality is he can't be trusted. His personality is one that's always going to act on that impulse to eat the cookie instead of acting on the impulse of how it could be to his detriment.
So then would the super ego be the moderator then?
No, the superego is just presenting the information. Here's the alternatives. Do this, it's going to be bad. You know, if you do it, here's how it could be good. The ego is the reality of what ends up happening.
Okay.
So if you think about the devil and the angel on the shoulder, they're not doing anything, right? In the cartoons, it's always the person who has to make a decision based on what's being told, what's being whispered into their ear, right? And so the person making the decision would be the ego. It's the reality of what's actually happening as a result of the influence of the superego. Okay. All right, I want to move on because I don't want to run out of time before we get through all of these, but we can come back and ask some more questions if some of this is still unclear at the end, okay? All right. So principal techniques when doing psychoanalytic theory. These are all ways that a counselor would kind of use this information about unconscious, preconscious, subconscious, id, ego, superego to draw greater awareness for the client. So one is interpretation, helping the client gain insight into both the past and present events. So we're going to interpret this experience that you have. Dream analysis, so interpreting the manifest or the obvious things that it could mean, and the latent or the hidden meanings of dreams. Free association, verbalizing whatever comes to mind, even if it's trivial. So we have a client sit down and just write free association, everything that comes to mind. Whatever comes to mind then is that conscious thought, but whatever is on the pre-conscious is just right on the tip of their tongue. And as they're writing, it kind of comes to the surface and then it becomes conscious. And then we interpret that. Analysis of resistance, helping the client to understand the basis for hesitation or stopping progress in therapy. So later on, one of the questions that we'll discuss has to do with, every time a client, the subject of their teen years comes up, they change the subject or say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. That resistance to talking about those teen years is information. It's helping the client to understand, okay, what's the basis for that hesitation in talking about your teen years? What's that about? That analysis of that resistance can lead towards that insight that helps the client to get unstuck from whatever may have happened in their teen years. Analysis of transference. So with transference, the client transfers or attributes issues from a prior significant authority figure to the counselor. So let's just say it's a female client and she was in an abusive relationship early on in her life, and it's difficult for her to really take in anything that a male counselor is saying. That transference can actually be beneficial to analyze if it helps the client to work through some of those issues that she might have with men. Okay, so those are all just primary techniques that are used to gain the insight in the counseling session. 4 primary phases of counseling. This is, if we were to kind of zoom in on any one of those primary techniques, we'd find these 4 phases happening where they're opening up to what's happening. They're developing an understanding of it. They're working through that insight and then resolving how that insight has kept them stuck. So that's on a much more micro level with any one of those previous techniques that we discussed right here. Okay. So that's a snapshot of what would be happening within the counseling room. So back to anxiety. Anxiety is this state of tension that motivates us to do something. So we're feeling anxious because every time I go home for the holiday days, I fight with my partner. Okay, that's anxiety. We got to figure out what that's about. Its function is to warn of impending danger and to signal to the ego to take action, or else the ego will be overthrown. Okay, so every time we go home for the holidays, there's tension between the partners. That anxiety is trying to warn the individual, hey, there's something about being home for the holidays that creates this tension. You got to do something about that, or else you're going to feel small. You're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to feel threatened in some way. And so 3 kinds of anxiety exist: real or objective anxiety. This might happen, let's say you're walking down the sidewalk and all of a sudden this really angry, ferocious dog jumps up at the fence and starts barking. That's real anxiety. It's in the moment. There's a legitimate threat that you feel. Neurotic anxiety is kind of an imagined. This is where we, in our mind, kind of catastrophize and think about worst possible outcomes that may not be actual. It's kind of manufactured in our own mind. Or moral anxiety, where we're in a position of having to do something that goes against values that we have for ourselves. And so those anxieties can trigger these difficult feelings that our ego responds to in ways to try and cope and protect our ego. And we call those responses ego defense mechanisms. Okay. So I want to make sure that we're not going too fast through this, that anxiety is showing up because at some point during development, we got stuck in one of those psychosexual stages. And the anxiety is warning our ego something's wrong here. And so we're going to adapt and cope and try to soothe that ego with an ego defense mechanism. And so what I want to do with the rest of this teaching time is discuss different ego defense mechanisms that are identified, that we lead clients to insight on to help get them unstuck. Okay. Any questions at this point? I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here, tracking along. We good? Okay, moving right along. So displacement. Displacement means displacing or directing a motion onto a person or object other than the one that originally aroused the emotion. So for example, a meek employee who is continually ridiculed by her boss builds up tremendous resentment, but verbally attacks family members instead of her boss, who might fire her. So can't take out this aggression against the boss, so I'm going to take out this aggression against a family member. That's displacement. Rationalization. Justifying behavior to yourself and to others with a well thought out and socially acceptable but fictitious reasons for certain behaviors. This is not just lying, it's a matter of habit and intensity. So we're going to rationalize why we can't do a certain thing because of some other thing that would be more acceptable. So a high school student explains away her failing of an algebra exam by saying, I really don't see why I have to take this course. I don't need it to graduate. And that teacher just sits there and doesn't explain anything. One way that I hear this come up with regards to the NCE is, why do I have to study this? I'm never going to actually use it in the counseling session. That would be rationalization. Or, I would have passed my exam, but I had all these things happen the day before. And sure, all those things that happened the day before are perfectly understandable, but it's a way of rationalizing why that individual didn't pass the exam, as an example for rationalization. Compensation. This means attempting to overcome the anxiety associated with a feeling of inferiority in one area by concentrating on another where the person can excel. This may be healthy and constructive, but it also may be avoidance. Okay, so for example, a woman who can't bear children becoming overly attached to pets, right? sometimes we'll say, oh, he must be compensating for something. And, he drives this really amazing car. And the assumption there is that he's got some sort of insecurity that he's trying to compensate for. So, he's trying to appear like he has it all together in one area, but he doesn't in another. So that's an example of compensation as well. Projection. This entails attributing to another person feelings and ideas that are unacceptable so that the other person seems to have these feelings and ideas. So we're going to project onto somebody else our own feelings of insecurity so that we're not seen as the one who's insecure. So for example, feeling like a coward and handling a situation, but blaming the outcome on the cowardice of the other person. Okay. Reaction formation. This involves exaggerating and openly displaying a trait that is the opposite of the tendencies that we do not want to recognize, these traits that have been repressed. So for example, people might be really zealous about smut or porn, but really have these hidden desires. And so reaction formation would be trying to portray themselves as very anti-pornography when really that's done because they've got this strong desire to look at it, or they've got an addiction to it, or something like that. That's reaction formation. We're going to form a reaction to this, even though it's really what we desire. Denial. This means failing or refusing to acknowledge or to recognize and deal with reality because of strong inner needs. So we're going to ignore the symptoms of a heart attack. We're going to deny that there's anything really going on. We're wearing copper bracelets. That's kind of an old-fashioned way of denying that anything's actually there. It's, I don't know, kind of superstitious. So we hear this a lot. They're in denial. They're not willing to acknowledge that there's actually a problem. Repression. Repression is an unconscious process of blocking urges. These are forbidden or dangerous desires or traumatic experiences from consciousness, the most basic defense mechanism according to Freud. Okay, and the difference between repression and suppression is a conscious process, whereas repression is unconscious. This is also different from denial, because denial is there's nothing happening with the consciousness of what is occurring. We're just not acknowledging that it's there. Repression is something that happens without us even thinking about it. If there's ever been a time that you've been with somebody that knew you as a child and said, hey, do you remember such and such event happening, and maybe it was a difficult event, but you have no recollection of it at all, that might have been repressed. I think personally that repression is kind of a gift sometimes, especially when children have experienced trauma. And, we don't want for them to be recalling that. I think repression is, a really good thing that they're not recalling this. So an example might be a police officer who witnesses the violent death of a fellow officer. They may press the incident out of consciousness because it symbolizes his own mortality. So rather than dealing with his own death or possibility that he could die, he just presses that incident out of his consciousness, essentially forgetting about it. But it's not in the pre-conscious where he could easily recall it. It's, I'm not even going to go there. It's not even on the radar anymore. Identification. This is the ego's way of attempting to overcome feelings of inferiority by taking on the characteristics of someone important to oneself. So a student who takes on characteristics or attributes of their mother, father, favorite teacher, or coach. The example that came to my mind, I'm not sure if you all have ever seen that Disney movie, The Incredibles. Well, Incrediboy, the little kid that ended up becoming the villain later on, he identified with Mr. Incredible and tried to take on his characteristics because of his own inferiority. And so that's a really great example of identification, is Incrediboy. Bobby, you got a question, comment? No? Okay. Okay, another ego defense mechanism is substitution. This involves achieving alternate goals and gratifications in order to mask feelings of frustration or anxiety. So young girls who miss their father shacking up with older men, right? They're substituting the connection that they wanted to have with their father by this connection with an older man, which of course cannot actually replicate the type of connection that would have been healthy. And so that substitution is just a defense mechanism. It's a way of dealing with that that wound of not being connected with their father. Fantasy. This involves retreating in one's own mind to a comfortable and maybe ideal setting, one that's better than the one that you're being presented with. While one of the most useful defense mechanisms, it can also become addictive and a substitute for honest effort. So instead of really dealing with the reality, I'm going to kind of retreat or escape. I would put video gaming into this category for a lot of people. Here where I live, we're real close to Fort Hood, and there's a lot of vets that deal with PTSD, and they retreat into video games because it creates this fantasy world that that comforts them. Okay, another example would be a partner does not feel that their needs are being met sexually, so they envision themselves engaging sexually with another person or in another way in their mind during intercourse that feels more ideal to them. Regression. Regression consists of reverting to a pattern or feeling, thinking or behavior appropriate to an earlier stage of development. So for example, a competent and capable adult acting very childish when sick in an attempt to have those around them provide greater care. So an adult really can take care of themselves, but they regress and become maybe more needy, wanting people to take care of them because having somebody take care of them brings them to a place where they, are resolving that conflict that occurred when they were developing. Sublimation is the redirecting of unacceptable impulses into socially and culturally acceptable channels. So one's need for approval leading to an interest in theater productions. So somebody really needs other people to admire and value them. And so a place to do that well, that's acceptable, is by joining the theater. That's an acceptable channel for having that need for approval met. Okay, we're almost done with defense mechanisms. Interjection is the taking in, absorbing, or incorporating into oneself the standards and values of another person. So for example, an abused child who becomes an abusive parent. They're incorporating into themselves what another person has done or embodied. Another way that this might happen is, I see this a lot with junior hires who are very kind of self-conscious and want to fit in. They'll introject the values. They'll start liking the things of their peers because it helps to soothe that feeling like they don't fit in. So they're going to pretend or take on the interests of somebody else. Undoing, this occurs when a person acts inappropriately, thus producing anxiety. Then the person acts in an opposite way so as to reverse or negate the original behavior, thus extinguishing the original anxiety. This is a great example. So a child yells at the dinner table and then offers to help with the dishes. They feel bad, and so they're going to try to undo that difficult feeling that yelling created and feel better by helping with the dishes. Emotional insulation is protecting oneself from hurt by withdrawing into passivity. So looking for a new job will bring rejection, so I'll just go with the flow and see what happens. We're going to insulate ourselves. We're going to create a padding that keeps us from really feeling hurt if we experience the disappointment or the letdown. Don't want to deal with the rejection, so I'm going to shrug it off like it's no big deal when really it probably is. Okay. And finally, we have isolation. This is separating the emotion from an experience so as to deal dispassionately with an otherwise emotionally overwhelming topic, making funeral arrangements instead of grieving. I call this bypassing sometimes. We're kind of compartmentalizing a particular thing and not dealing with it by distracting ourselves with something else. So that's a really good example of, instead of really dealing with the pain of a loss, somebody might, get ultra focused on funeral arrangements or other types of details related to that loss. Okay, that's a lot of information about ego defense mechanisms. I'm going to link to or share a PDF in the chat that has all of these. If I can figure out how to do that. It's not letting, oh, there we go. So if you are viewing this later, you can find this in the downloadable documents that go along with the course. So all this information is going to be in that. All of those defense mechanisms are in this list of terms that I've just put in the chat, and that should be available underneath the video that you're viewing. Okay, so let's talk about application. How do we take all this information and actually apply it on the NCE? How might we see it? Obviously, any test questions that I present here are completely made up. Nobody really knows what test questions there are. So this is just the best guess for what you might see on the exam. Okay, so go ahead and unmute if you want, because we're going to interact about these and just kind of discuss them. So which of the following answers most correctly includes techniques vital to the psychoanalytic model of therapy? I'm going to give you a second to read through these. And if you have an answer, go ahead and just say what you think the answer is, and we'll kind of unpack it from there.
B.
Okay, B. Are you still with us, Brooke?
I am.
Okay, which one do you think it is? You don't have to share if you don't want to, but.
It's fine. I was looking at A.
Okay.
Well, we know C, reframing is behavioral, and redeciding. We don't redecide in that.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
So the thing that doesn't fit the psychoanalytic model between A and B is in B, word association.
Yeah.
That's not part of psychoanalytic model. What might be free association, that might be the little buzz phrase that feels like it's there, but that free association is not connecting one word to another like we have with word association. So
that's what was taking me a second, because I was like, see the association, but I was looking for free
right.
for the fourth term, but there wasn't a fourth term, just 3 of the 4.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
so that's A,
that's a really
gives you A instead of B.
Sure. That method that you guys jumped in to use to narrow it down was really a good answering methodology of eliminating the ones that you know don't fit.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some questions on the NCE that like there's 2 answers that really look like they could fit. So you have to really zero in on the one that's most likely to be the case or that's most correct. And so even though word association, could maybe mean, the free association because the words, answer A, interpretation, dream analysis, and analysis of resistance. Those are 3 techniques that, that were specifically mentioned earlier, having to do with psychoanalytic. And so, yeah. So that's one way that this information could be applied on the exam is through just, here's buzzwords that which of these fit with this particular theory. And so you'd have to rule out the answers that have items or phrases or words that don't fit real neatly. It's hard because some of these theories have a lot of overlapping techniques and models because they're based on one another, right? They build on previous theorists. And so I heard somebody say that it's really a reading exam. And so you have to read real carefully to make sure that you're not missing one word that could nuance your answer. Okay. Any other questions about this one before we move on to another question? Yeah, so there it is. Interpretation, dream analysis, analysis of resistance. Okay. After seeing a client for 5 sessions, The counselor realizes that whenever the subject of life as a teenager is discussed, the client will shrug and claim it's no big deal and change the subject. After bringing it up, the client acknowledges that they do this, but still changes the subject. The counselor continues to circle back to the client's responses despite their discomfort. How is the counselor's behavior best explained? Okay, so go ahead and read through the answers.
B,
B, you think?
I think so.
Okay. Brooke, any thoughts?
I would
Could be A, but
definitely eliminate C. D would be my next one to rule out. So I would be between A and B.
Okay.
If you're looking at just the basis of how the counselor's behavior is best explained, and then so if you're looking for key words, the client acknowledges that they're doing it, but the counselor continues to circle back despite their discomfort. So, I mean,
I like the way you're thinking.
mm-hmm. So the counselor continues to circle back. So the client's uncomfortable, but they acknowledge that. But the counselor recognizes the client's hesitation. Yes, it's a barrier to progress, and believes helping them is the key. But
it is emotional insulation.
but it is an ego defense mechanism of emotional insulation. So
Right.
of those two, I would probably go with A, because that's a specific as to why they're circling and acknowledging based on the psychoanalytic process.
Okay. Yeah. So,
Long answer short. Oh, but it's B.
okay. So, I think again, you guys are on the right track with kind of teasing out each of the words. How is the counselor's behavior best explained? So, could it be explained by A? Yes. In my opinion, it's best explained when we're thinking about the therapeutic process of helping the client gain insight and move forward, that recognizing that the client's hesitation is a barrier for progress in therapy and believes helping them to see it is the key to moving forward. They might see that, they might come to that understanding that it's emotional insulation, but that emotional insulation, as far as what the counselor is trying to do,
It's
is
a
to,
process,
it's a
not a
process.
behavior.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So that's why B was there. Again, this is an actual exam question. So the way that you guys were teasing it out, I think, is really, really good. You definitely caught the main points of that. Okay. Good job picking up that that's emotional insulation. In psychoanalytic theory, life and death instincts are contained in which structure of personality? The ego, the superego, the libido, or the id?
Well, we can rule out C.
We can rule out C. Some people might think life and death exists in the libido.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you're talking to, but
right.
Life and death.
So, what do you think?
I'm gonna rule out D, because that's unconscious. Maybe.
Okay.
And life and death, well, I mean, Life and death to me would be a category. So I would go with B, but I really don't know.
Okay. Bobby, do you have anything to weigh in on?
Or it's a reality.
Well, it would probably be, A.
You think A? Okay. So let's focus on the word instincts here.
So would that be more libido? But that's the sex drive, right? I mean,
Right.
that's,
Libido is a sex drive. Yeah. If we're focusing on the word instincts, life and death instincts, like, oh, this is a matter of life and death. I've got to do this.
so that would be the superego.
Well, that would be the id.
The id, because that's pleasure.
The id,
The id is the pleasure principle. Okay. Pleasure. Don't confuse pleasure with always seeking pleasure, but maybe pleasure sometimes also means avoiding pain.
Right.
Right. So the id is what drives, am I going to receive pleasure or pain from this? It's the pleasure principle. And so those life or death instincts are, okay, this is a matter of life or death. Back to our kid that, wants the cookie. It's a matter of life or death, whether he gets to eat it or not. Right. If he doesn't get to eat it, right, he may throw a temper tantrum. It was a matter of life or death. That instinct that I've got to have it, that comes from the id.
okay.
Okay. If you're aware of that instinct and you can think through, okay, is this really a matter of life or death? Am I going to be okay? Am I not going to be okay? That's the super ego categorizing things. And then the response and the way that your personality deals with those decisions would be the ego. Okay. Instincts is the key word there to focus for the id. An instinct, an impulse, something that's happening without you even think. So instincts is unconscious, right? Okay. Counselor is treating a man who has been married for 9 years. The man claims he does not feel respected by his wife and that she does not ever listen to him when he asks her for help. He says after feeling disrespected by her, he is irritable the rest of the day, and he even kicked the dog once when it would not come inside when asked. Which of the following ego defense mechanisms best explains why he kicked his dog?
Displacement.
Displacement? You're
He's
correct.
displacing it. Well, or it could be he's projecting his anger onto his wife or the dog, but he's displacing his, well, yeah, it might be projection because he's projecting onto the dog his anger for his wife. No, it was displacement. Don't ever change your answer.
That's right. That's another answering methodology. Whatever your first response is, don't second guess it. Right? Yeah, displacement. That's what I had in mind when I wrote this one. But you're right. It may have, if displacement hadn't been there, and projection was, that may have been the better answer. Right? Okay, we're going to have to move through these a little bit faster. Freud purported that the part of the personality structure which assimilates new material and insights gained in counseling is the what? Focus on the word assimilates.
I'm going to say ego.
You would be correct. Assimilates is what we do with the information and the insight that we've gained. We're going to assimilate that. That's the whole goal of psychoanalytic theory, is to recreate the ego structure based on the new insight that we've gained. Okay. Defense mechanisms serve to what? Unconsciously and rationally combat impulses, unconsciously and irrationally combat ego anxiety, consciously and rationally combat moral dilemmas, consciously and rationally combat what is unknown. Defense mechanisms.
I'm gonna say
B.
B.
B, you guys are rocking it, right? An ego defense mechanisms trying to soothe the ego's anxiety, right? You guys are doing awesome. So this, again, these are just some ways that that all this could show up. Let's see, it's 3. I got a little bit of time. If you guys have some time, I've got a few more questions. You want to work through a few more questions or move into Q&A? Okay.
I'd rather go through questions.
You'd rather go through questions?
Sure. I mean, unless she has questions. If she has questions, we can do that.
Okay. I just have to go in about 10 minutes. And so my time is free until then. But these questions, these next 4 questions all have to do with these 4 answers. Okay. And so this is just a way of understanding each of these concepts. Okay. So a client deals with being fired from their job saying, it wasn't that important to me anyway. I can find any job I want, one that pays better too, with better insurance and more flexible hours. This is an example of
Rationalization.
Rationalization, right? I'm going to rationalize not getting the job. Good. Okay. After witnessing a shootout on vacation and a bullet hitting their car, a 9-year-old child starts bedwetting again.
Regression.
Regression, right? They had previously moved past that anal phase and now they've regressed back into it. Good. You guys are great at this. A group of adult siblings sits around talking about the time they went to the beach with friends when they were young. They recall accidentally leaving the youngest sibling at the restaurant. The youngest sibling has no recollection of the event. This is an example of
Repression.
Yes, repression. They repressed that memory. It was so traumatic, they don't recall it at all. And obviously, we've got the husband and wife are offered the chance to go skydiving. It sounds really exciting at first, but then the husband decides that they shouldn't go because he's worried about his wife's nerves and anxiety flaring up. Inwardly, he's really afraid of heights. This is an example of
Rationalization.
Projection.
Projection, right, by default, right? Projection. He's projecting his own fear of heights onto his wife, and it's not really her. Okay. Okay, so any questions? I know that was a lot of information to throw at you. I think that's an overview, and hopefully you can see how some of those theory concepts and techniques might show up on the NCE. But I want to leave time. Any questions that you guys have?
No, I'm just anxious to get through the exam. I know I studied really hard for it for a while there, and then I backed off for, a while, but now I'm ready to hit it pretty hard before September 8th.
Yeah.
Starting with this weekend, I think.
Good.
Going back through the whole manual and do the whole exam again, and then do the, keep the two to keep doing the least 2. I feel like I'd pass it now, but I'd have anxiety if I didn't study up until then.
Sure. Yeah. And, study enough that you don't have anxiety anymore, but don't let your anxiety, do what you can to not let the anxiety carry into the test. Some of the studies have shown that you can really kind of sabotage by having that anxiety, just by not being relaxed. Questions that you would otherwise know the answer to would be marked, you'd answer incorrectly. So,
well, right, that's like the first question, because it is, it's pre-association, it's not word association, but I just bam, see how fast I answer those questions.
Right.
That's what I do. And
yeah, read each one carefully. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Brooke, do you have any questions or thoughts? How are you feeling about your exam prep?
I think my brain is on overload because I sat and did that full exam this morning.
Yeah.
So I had just filled out my sheet before we started. So I did my my worst to best. And so I was kind of sitting down and doing my plan for diving in tomorrow. Sure. So this was a good starting point. And
good. Was that the first full-length simulation that you took?
Yes, sir.
Can I ask how you did?
Not while it's recording.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to stop recording.